Hi, everybody, and welcome to our lecture for today, where we are going to be focusing on the X-linked uh, conditions or traits. We are going to briefly mention Y chromosome, but it's not going to be as detailed as it is for X, and we'll see in just a minute why that is the case. We would look at some of the inheritance patterns that are associated with the X-linked traits. We would look at the concept of inactivation of your X chromosome and how does that in long term affect the phenotype of the offspring. Now, one of the first things that we want to understand is that when we're talking about the sex chromosome, which is chromosome pair number 23, or going to be chromosome that determine the gender of the offspring. So anytime you have what we call an XY chromosome set, that implies that the offspring will be a male. We call that heterogametic sex, which because basically means that the two sex chromosomes are different from one another. Versus when we're looking at the female offspring, we have XX, which we call it homogametic sex because both the parents, male and female, are contributing an X chromosome to the genetic information for the offspring. Now, looking at the chromosome X versus chromosome Y, there is about 1,500 genes that are present on your X chromosome because it's larger, and the second chromosome acts a homolog to your Y in males. The Y chromosome, however, is much shorter and only carries about 231 genes. Many of the DNA segments are, if they're absent or they are mutated, will cause impotency and problem with the male ability to basically create an offspring. So here's basically what I was talking about. So they are transmitted, the Y chromosome only gets transmitted from male to male. And again, if you are creating a female, the male contribution is the X portion of the sex chromosome. And as I mentioned, just to kind of repeat that, if there are any Y-linked traits that have been mutated, it usually causes an infertility and therefore cannot be transmitted to the next generation. Now, as we're going to go through the rest of the PowerPoint, we will be focusing on the X-linked traits. As we mentioned, there is quite a few genes on the X chromosome based on its size. And it is important because it does get passed to either of the genders, and therefore they do contribute greatly to our traits and our phenotypes. Now, how does the X-linked traits differ if they get passed on to a female versus a male? So again, remember females have two copies of the X chromosome. So in females, X-linked traits are passed like autosomal traits because again, you have two copies of the X chromosome. So if you have a dominant, they will demonstrate the dominant characteristics. And if they both have a recessive characteristic, if both X's have the recessive characteristics, then it's an absence of the trait. In males, however, it would be different because male only have one copy of the X chromosome being received from their maternal side. And therefore, if you do have that X-linked condition in that X chromosome, it will cause an expression of that specific trait, and in some cases, the disorder we're talking about. Now, we are going to add another word to our vocabulary. We are familiar with the concept of homozygous versus heterozygous. So homozygous, again, simply meant that the genotypes have the same two identical alleles, versus heterozygous implied that the two alleles are different. Now, the new word is hemizygous. Hemizygous implies that the genotype consists of only a single copy of the particular gene. So for instance, if we're looking at the male, you only have a single copy of the X chromosome and a single copy of the Y chromosome. please understand that this is still a diploid organism, which means you getting two copies. It's just that those two copies are associated with two separate sex chromosomes. One is an X, the other one is Y, versus for the rest of the chromosome, which are your autosomal chromosome, you will have two copies of chromosome 1, two copies of chromosome 2, etc., etc. Now, how to determine the sex in humans? Again, it's a 50% chance. If you look at the image on the top, you have your you have your female that's contributing the X's. And in male, it's either X or Y. So if they're both receiving an X, you receive an XX, which makes that a female. Same here, that's also an XX, which makes that female. So again, that's 50% chance. And on the bottom, you see that the male is contributing a Y chromosome instead of the X, making the two bottom images a male in terms of the sex of the individual or the offspring. Now, when we're talking about the X-linked recessive trait, so this is not a dominant trait that we've been talking about before. X-recessive implies that you have to have two copies of the recessive gene present on both of the X chromosomes, and in that case, you will see the condition or trait being present in that individual. Now, if the condition is not lethal, then the person may be healthy enough in terms of the female, and they will pass that a specific characteristic or trait onto their offspring. However, in case of males, this is, sorry, I should say in case of males, I think I said females. In case of males, that characteristics is, or trait can be passed on unless that characteristic actually cause a lethal change in the chromosomes or in that individual, and therefore causing a disorder leading to lethality. Now, again, in X-linked chromosome, you must have two copies of the recessive gene for you to actually see the result of that. So let's say you have to have, if this is a female and this is a male, the female, let's say the condition we're talking about is hemophilia, for instance. So female have to have hemophilia on both of the X's for her to actually show hemophilia. But in case of male, you only need one copy of the hemophilia to be recessive, and then you will see that symptoms being developed because you don't have a second X chromosome to help partially mask the symptoms. Now, some of the medical conditions that are associated with the X-linked recessive trait, one is ichthyosis, which is where you have a deficiency in an enzyme, and therefore you are unable to remove cholesterol from the skin. And that's the picture or the image you see on the right side of your screen. And to kind of expand on that, what you see here is you have a male that is affected. So let's say we represent it with a lowercase x. And in this case, the female can either be X capital I, X lowercase I, or X capital I, X capital I. In either of these two scenarios, the female would not show any symptoms, but male only has one copy of it and therefore will represent that. Now, if they create their offspring, which is a female, that female has, so in this case, number one, the female will have XI from the father and then XI from the mother, which means that now she is a carrier and therefore will be passing that genetic information forward to their next generation. Now, the next thing we want to talk about here is, and by the way, if you're wondering why the child here also has it, is let's say the male is XIY, but because the child here is a male, it means the male has passed on its Y, right? So the Y has come down here, and the female passed down its XI, which means now the child of this individual will have the same trait as their father and as her father. Now, the other medical condition that's X-linked recessive is the color blindness. About 8% of the males in European ancestry have this condition. And again, notice in females is not as high or very uncommon because it is an X-linked recessive, which means you have to have 2 recessive copies on your X chromosome for it to be observed in females. And hemophilia is another one. Now, the word hemophilia simply means that you are unable to effectively form blood clots. So if you cut yourself, you have a very long bleeding time and clotting time. What I wanted to just kind of show you what that looks like. Again, because it's a recessive trait, we are looking at, and we're going to represent it with H. If you have this scenario, right? This is a female, and both of it is dominant, which means there is no hemophilia in this individual. This is an example of a male with no hemophilia, right? Because it has the X copy, but the X is the dominant version of the gene. This is another example of a female which does not have hemophilia, but is identified as a carrier of the disease because of the lowercase here. And then if we have this case, then this is the one that when the male will be hemophilic because it has received a recessive copy of the hemophilia gene or the proteins from the X-linked chromosome. Now, you don't necessarily need to know any of what the chart is saying, but it's kind of, again, highlighting here what is important. So in this case, what's highlighted is that you have a mom that is basically a carrier, right? Because of the capital H lowercase, which means it's a heterozygous. And then this one, you have a father that has no hemophilia. However, the kid can possibly be a carrier if they're a female, or they can actually have the disease if they are a male. So let's follow this track. So in the first box right here, what they're both contributing is a capital H, which means there is no chance of this child having any hemophilia. And because it's an X and X, you have 25% chance of having a girl or a female that is normal. And I'm going to kind of spell it out. Now, the box right next to it, again, both are contributing X's. So it means there is going to be a girl. And because this is heterozygous, they're going to have no symptoms. So there are no symptoms, but they are carrier of the medical condition. And again, this is 25%, one capital X and one lowercase h. Now, this one, we're now going into male. So we're talking about male. So this is, again, another 25% or 1/4. So in this case, the mother is passing a healthy capitalized or dominant gene, and the father is passing a Y. So in this case, you have a male that has no, so basically normal, let's say. And again, the reason is this is X that has received from the mom. So, and we don't really care about the Y chromosome. And the last one is the mom has passed this last box. Mom has passed the lowercase h, which means it's recessive. And because the second one is a Y, you have nothing to mask it. So this would be a male because of the presence of the Y. And because of a single copy of the hemophilia, this person will have hemophilia. So if the question asks you, in the scenario that is given, what's the chance of having a son? Again, having a son that is hemophilic, it's basically 1 in 2 chances, right? because sun is 50%, so it's already half. So you have a chance of having a sun that is normal and a sun that has hemophilic. So 1 out of 2 chances. If I say, what is the chance of you having a child that has a specific thing, then it's 25% for each of them. But again, this is gender, this is one gender, this is the second gender. Now, another dominant trait that we talked about recessive traits. So let's talk about the dominant trait for the X-linked. So X-linked dominant traits are very rare because that typically causes problems, and that mutations or that problem can cause very severe effect on the person if it is associated with the disorders. So gene expression in this case are different between the sexes. If you have a female who's inherited a dominant X chromosome, or sorry, not X chromosome, a dominant X-linked trait, they are going to be possibly okay, but not necessarily. But again, it's very rare. But in male who are inheriting that dominant X link, because again, you're only getting one copy of that, there is nothing that's going to mask or help you mask the effect of it. Therefore, the condition in male would be much more severe. So, what does that exactly mean? In most cases, first of all, let me explain this one. In most cases, if we're talking about an X-linked dominant trait, which means that you have a dominant version of the gene on the X and you only need one copy for it to be represented. This is not something that gets passed down from the parents to the offspring. This is typically as a result of a mutation that changes a recessive copy to a dominant copy. That's where that change is happening. That mutation is the reason. It is not something that is inherited from the previous generation. So that's something to remember. One of the examples of these X-linked dominant traits is called Rett syndrome. And Rett syndrome is a very rare medical condition that affects the development of the female, I guess, development of the female brain or nervous system. So they are identified as handicaps. There are certain characteristics, and you guys can do your own little quick research on see what the symptoms are. But typically, the best way to describe it is their nervous system slash brain development is significantly slower compared to a normal individual. We don't discuss them in males because, again, the severity is much more, and therefore they do not survive. Incontinentia pigmentia is another condition, is another, the one that I'm drawing for you. Oh, sorry, I have a picture of it on the right-hand side of your slide. This is a genetic condition that affects the skin. You form this kind of almost blisters all over the skin. It also has other effect on the systems like your liver, your digestive system, respiratory, and heart. So it does affect other parts of the body. But for us to understand this, I wanted to kind of show you this Punnett square that highlights the importance. So we have, up here, we have a affected heterozygous female. And again, this is, we're saying using the word affected because it is showing symptoms, but again, it's because it's one of the 2 copies is partially masked. So this mom can pass either the dominant copy or the recessive copy to their eggs. The father in this case is contain the recessive copy of the gene, which means that they do not have that trait. In other sense, they are unaffected. Now, in this case, the top portion again would be females. So you can have a child that is affected and is female, right? And a child that has no affected because they receive both of the recessive copies from both parents. So that is only contributing the recessive copy, and a mom in this case is also contributing the recessive one. In the bottom half of the Punnett square, we're describing our male. So one thing is that the mom can pass the X that has the dominant gene, which means that is the son is going to be affected because the dad is not contributing anything other than the Y. So it is an X-linked, so Y is not going to do anything. And another scenario, we can have the X that has unaffected allele on it or the recessive allele on it be contributed from the mom side and then Y from your dad's side. And therefore you create a son that is unaffected because the X chromosome that has been passed on has the recessive allele and not the dominant allele. Here's a chart that allows you to kind of view and review the X-linked recessive versus X-linked dominant genes. So again, X-linked recessive is going to always express in males because you're only getting one copy of that X. But in female, X-linked dominant express in only one copies of the female for it to be identified. In case of X-linked recessive, you must have two copies of that gene to be expressed, and it's very rarely heterozygous. But X-linked dominant, again, is going to have a much more severe effect on the males because, again, you only has one X. So if that has the dominant gene on it, you're already going to have the symptoms. There is not a second recessive one that can mask partially the effects or the trait or the disorder, and therefore it would be much more severe in males. Now, affected male inherit traits from the heterozygous or homozygous mother. Again, the mother can contribute the lowercase x as either or I should say the trait as either I have two X's that are homozygous, or one X is capitalized, the other one is smaller. And in case of male, if it's a dominant thing, it you just causes miscarriage because it's considered a lethal mutation. And basically, you look at the body looks at the cell and said, nope, you don't look right now. So I'm just going to destroy it. So it leads to the destruction of the cell. So it doesn't even allow the male to be created by that specific characteristic. Okay. Now, the last concept that we're going to talk about in our lecture today is the concept of X inactivation. This is a really cool concept because so far what we've been talking about is that the X chromosome in females, there's two copies of that. And therefore, you have the ability to partially protect females from some of the disease that may affect men more severely. Because again, you have a second copy that kind of think about it as your backup. Now, there is a situation where you have one of these X chromosome literally become inactive. And that helps balance the inequality in terms of the expression of the genes for the X chromosome. So now if you're a male or a female, you both have access to only one X chromosome. Now, this is really cool. In this scenario, what we create is in female mammals, we're going to create something called a mosaic expression, which basically means some of the genes will have the inactive X chromosome, and the other genes will not have any changes from the original sequence. So one of the examples of this is the XYST gene that encodes for a specific RNA. And this RNA literally binds to your X chromosome and causes its inactivation. So you literally have a gene that causes inactivation of one of the X chromosomes. Now, here's what I want you guys to understand. And I'll go back to the previous picture. X activation can literally be used as a check for the sex of the individual. Because if you have, again, those mosaic pattern, it implies that a female where one of the X chromosome has been deactivated. Now, the inactivated X chromosome is referred to as the Barr body. It still stays inside the nucleus. However, it does not have any function. None of those genes can be transcribed and translated. Now, the consequence of you inactivating the X chromosome have a effect on the phenotype, which can be very interesting. If you have a homozygous X-linked genotype, you will not see any effect because, again, you have the same identical gene. So by taking one out, nothing's going to happen, right? You still have the other copy that's going to do the exact same job. However, if you have a heterozygous, what it creates is it creates an additional um, pattern or characteristics or phenotype. And I'll expand on that in just a second. So let's take a look at this picture right now. So in this picture, what you have is the maternal and the paternal information was passed on to a fertilized egg, which is the first image that we're starting up here. So you already have the egg and the sperm coming together. And in this case, because both parents are contributing an X chromosome, the offspring will be a female. Now, here's what happened. At some point during the earliest stages of cell division, some of these X chromosomes, some of the cells, as they're undergoing their process of mitosis, inactivate their X chromosome, one of the X chromosomes in their sequence. So not every cell in the body, but some of the X chromosomes copy will be silenced or inactivated. Now, what happens as the process of mitosis keeps going on, the cells that are that do not have any changes, they don't have any inactivation, they stay normal. So these are the cells you see in that kind of orangish color. Now, the cells that have undergone the X inactivation, so now they only have one copy of the X chromosome, that is a different phenotype, right? So because it was a heterozygous, right? The original thing that we were talking about earlier, which says heterozygous here at the bottom, it leads to expression of one allele and other. So in this case, because it was a heterozygous gene, the skin will have patches that are going to be I should say, they do not have the proper trait that was absent or has taken away because of the inactivation of the X chromosome. So going back to this example that I have, this is again, it's going to be just kind of writing it down for you. Heterozygous for the X chromosome. So let's say we're talking about sweat glands. So you have this version, right? Capital S for sweat glands being present, lowercase s for sweat glands being absent, right? So that happens. So some of the cells have both capital S's, and these cells are perfectly happy. Nothing has changed in them. They lead to normal skin with the right amount of sweat glands. Now, what if this line, the other option is that you have a cell where capital X and S, and then you have this little bar body that is the inactivated X chromosome. Again, this one also leads to what? Normal, because both of them still have the dominant gene. But what if, I'm going to write it up here, what if I have the following scenario? I have X lowercase s and the bar body for the dominant gene. In this case, the cells that have this specific pattern are not going to have no sweat glands in the skin. So you have patches in your body that are green in this case because these cells have inactivated the dominant copy of the gene, and therefore the only thing that is present is the recessive copy and the absence of that trait, in this case, the sweat glands. I think some of you guys may have heard of these specific cats too. I'm not going to go into detail about them. These calico cats are cats that have three color patterns, and the main reason is because of that, again, X inactivation. It's certain cells and then fully activated in the other one, and then having a heterozygous in the other cells. So you're getting that three color pattern. All I want you guys to understand is that having the three colors is associated with the fact that you have a heterozygous gene that has undergone X inactivation and therefore created an extra color on the fur of the cat. So when you guys looking at this lecture, I really want you guys to focus on understanding the difference between the X-linked recessive versus X-linked dominant and how that affected. Make sure you can understand how it's distinguished between male and female, and how X-links typically affect male more significantly. It can even cause little changes that leads to the destruction of the embryo at very early stages. And then I want you guys to make sure you understand the concept of X inactivation. As a result, how does that affect the mosaic pattern that we talked about, where part of the cells are representing the specific characteristics, and sometimes because of the formation of the bar body and X inactivation, you create the absence of that trait in certain regions of the body. That's about it for our lecture today. Please, of course, if you have any questions for me, let me know. Other than that, good luck and have a good one.